When I say I'm interested in characters or the psychology of characters, I guess in a broader dramatic sense, what I mean is I'm interested in observing people's motives. I'm interested in observing the kind of action that comes out of those motives, and then, in a way, seeing what does that do to their lives. I'm not interested in psychology from a particularly academic point of view, but if a person, for example, is extremely devoted to the acquisition of wealth, I'm interested in following that through the course of a story and seeing what happens to that person. When we want one thing, the question is, what have we sacrificed to get it? And was the benefit worth the cost? That's what I'm interested in.
Γεια σας. Σήμερα θα σας παρουσιάσω το συγγραφέα αστυνομικών μυθιστορημάτων John Verdon, ο οποίος ήρθε στη χώρα μας για να παρουσιάσει το τρίτο του μυθιστόρημα με τον τίτλο «Άσε το διάβολο ήσυχο», το οποίο κυκλοφορεί από τις εκδόσεις Διόπτρα σε μετάφραση του Γιώργου Μπαρουξή. Σε αυτό το βιβλίο ο συγγραφέας βάζει τον detective Dave Gurney να εξιχνιάσει μια σειρά δολοφονιών, των οποίων τα κίνητρα φαίνεται να είναι ιδεολογικά. Ο δολοφόνος στέλνει στον τύπο ένα μανιφέστο στο οποίο κατηγορεί ανοιχτά για τα δεινά όλου του κόσμου τους άπλιστους και διεφθαρμένους κεφαλαιοκράτες. Όμως τα πράγματα δεν είναι ακριβώς όπως φαίνονται. Η δύναμη του βιβλίου έγκυται στους χαρακτήρες και στην πλοκή του. Ο Βέρντον αποδεικνύεται ένας πάρα πολύ καλός μαέστρος και γι' αυτό νομίζω ότι είναι ένα ανάγνωσμα που θα απολαύσετε στις διακοπές σας. Και μην κρίνετε ποτέ ένα βιβλίο μόνο από το εξώφυλλό του. Ας δούμε όμως τη συνέντευξη που έκανα στον John Verdon πριν από λίγο καιρό.
The new book is about Dave Gurney being brought into a case in which there's a general acceptance of what it's all about. And as usual with some of these books, Dave has a different impression of what's really happening. And as he gets into it, that impression strengthens and he digs deeper and deeper. And in the course of it makes a few enemies, but finally gets to the root of something that turns out to be a lot different from the way it looked at first. There's certainly an element of the book that has to do with a certain kind of media phenomenon that's very common today. And it's something that I actually believe is quite dreadful. And what it really amounts to is the sale of conflict, the sale of crisis, the sale of anger and resentment. I think there's a certain slice of the media today that thrives on making things as ugly and sensational as they possibly can. And that kind of media certainly plays a role in this book, and in fact it played into the whole concept of what The Murderer was about. I come out of the advertising world and I spent over 30 years in advertising in New York. Oddly, I think the greatest impact that had on me was coming to understand a certain kind of group dynamic. Now, this isn't advertising specifically, but what it's about is when you're involved in a corporate environment, you tend to have some big meetings with some pretty smart, interesting people. And some of them have their own agendas. Some of the agendas are a little more obvious than some of the others. But watching and listening to people like that over the years, I think, helped me to craft certain of the group dynamic scenes in this book. Now, some people have asked whether, Dave Gurney is like me or I'm like Dave Gurney and, how close the comparison is. But I'd say that Dave Gurney and I have certain traits in common. Dave Gurney and I are certainly both introverts. We're both more comfortable in a sense by ourselves than we are with large groups of people. I think Dave Gurney and I, for better or worse, spend more time in our own heads than we do with other people. I like figuring things out, so does Dave Gurney. That being said, I think Dave Gurney has some strengths that I couldn't claim. Dave Gurney was a homicide detective for most of his life. To me, that kind of career, that kind of activity requires levels of, well, for courage, for want of any better word for it, a level of courage that I can't picture myself being in that world dealing with the kind of people that Dave Gurney deals with. But underneath it all, I think Dave and I are probably similar in some ways. I guess another aspect of the books is the way they deal with just the current environment that we live in. And although the books do deal with that, and the latest book certainly deals with a certain kind of, if you want to call it a problem with a degree of materialism and so forth, it's there, it's in the books, but I think it's a byproduct of something else. I'm interested in the characters. I'm interested in the stories. I'm interested in the characters' emotions and motivations. Now, a lot of that may reflect things going on in our world today, but I'm not a sociologist, and I'm not primarily interested in economic trends or social trends. I'm interested in these people, but in my mind, these people live in the world we live in today. And so I think maybe a commentary on the world we live in comes out of that as a byproduct. In the new book, there's probably a greater emphasis on what it might appear to be an ideological focus. The killer in this new book certainly has a certain ideological focus in his manifesto, which purports to explain the reason for his crimes. This is an odd distinction. I'm not so much interested in ideologies as I'm interested in ideas and psychology. I'm interested in how the killer uses that ideology to accomplish a certain goal. I'm not particularly interested in ideological or political positions. I'm interested in the psychology of individual people and how perhaps that psychology starts to reflect an ideology. I think that I always had a desire to write something. I wasn't quite sure what. I think from the time I was in school, I remember a teacher told me that I was a good writer and that I ought to pursue that, but I never quite knew how to do it. I got involved in advertising, and that consumed most of my business life. It wasn't until I retired that something started to change. One of the things that changed is I started reading more. And as I read, what I discovered was that the books that absorbed me the most were mysteries, crime stories, detective stories. And after reading quite a few of them, I started to get fascinated by the structure of these stories. And I remember one night I was mentioning this to my wife, in fact going into it in quite a bit of detail, this, the developmental arc of a detective story. And she said to me, if you understand that structure so well, why don't you try to write one yourself? And that was really the catalyst. And it was shortly after she said that I started working on Think of a Number. I'd love to see my stories, I'd love to see my characters on the screen. There have been some discussions underway in Hollywood for some time now about creating a high-quality TV series around Dave Gurney and the Dave Gurney books. I must admit Hollywood is a bit of a mystery to me, and we'll see what happens, but I'm hopeful.
Αυτό ήταν ένα ακόμα Garage Books. Αφήστε σχόλιο κάτω από την ανάρτηση για να μπείτε στην κλήρωση 3 αντιτύπων του βιβλίου και μέχρι το επόμενο τα λέμε.